Testing. There we go. Welcome, both our audience here at the National Museum of the American Indian, live from the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., and to our audience within the room here. We are very excited to bring to you, for the very first time, live from the Smithsonian Latino Center's Young Ambassadors Program, a conversation regarding representing Latino communities. We are going to be talking to a few people, distinguished people, who have been doing a lot of this work in the field, representing the contemporary Latino community in all its facets through a variety of different media platforms. We invite our Facebook Live followers to ask questions at the end of the session. This will go for about 75 minutes. That's about a 60-minute conversation and 15-minute question and answer at the end. We are very lucky here at the Smithsonian Latino Center to run a leadership development program for high school seniors, where we bring students from 17 cities across the country and Puerto Rico to Washington, D.C. for an all-expenses-paid trip where they have a leadership development program and they participate in conversations such as the one you are about to witness today. They also then return home to their home communities, and they do a 4-week internship in museums and cultural centers, and they practice skills that'll help them as they go on to their college careers in the fall. Afterwards, they join an alumni network of about 200 people from across the country, and there's more for them to learn, experience, and grow, and also do community outreach in your cities around the country. We are grateful to the Ford Motor Company Fund for their support of this program and their long-standing collaboration with both the Smithsonian and the Smithsonian Latino Center. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists. For everyone who is on Facebook Live, you will be able to also ask questions that our panelists can answer at the end of the program. So we will have 3 panelists and a moderator. Starting with my left here, we have Alberto Ferreras. He's an independent filmmaker and writer, and he's the creator of the HBO Habla series, which is an incredible series that documents Latino stories and experiences and has been going on for quite a few years, and you should definitely check it out. Next to him is Elianne Ramos. She is a social media entrepreneur, Latino advocate, and the CEO of Speak Hispanic, and she is joining us from Baltimore. She came down especially to have this conversation with you about how social media engages in representing the community that we are a part of. To her left is Adrian Florido. He is a reporter with NPR. He is part of the podcast series Code Switch, and he'll be talking to us a little bit about his efforts with Code Switch, as well as his recent participation in covering the story of the Orlando shootings. And finally, but not least, and to his left, is Gustavo Arellano. He's a writer, author, columnist. He has a syndicated column called Ask a Mexican. You should check it out. It's syndicated around the country. And he's also written a couple of books, one of them which is Taco USA, How Mexican Food Conquered America. You should check that book out as well. It's quite an interesting read. And a little bit goes into a little bit of the detail of what we're going to be talking about, which is how the Latino community is represented and how media engages in representing and communicating with our community. And so without further ado, Alberto Ferreras, I turn it to you.
Hi, everybody. I think I should start by saying that English is my second language, so I will make mistakes, but I'm not ashamed to. And but hey, anyway, we're going to talk about being bilingual, being bicultural, and finding your identity. So I think it's appropriate to make mistakes, as many as we want.
Spanglish.
Exactly, for the people. And speaking of Spanglish and Spanish, and there's a word in Spanish when you're a journalist or a storyteller in general, they call you comunicador, which is not a word that we have in Spanish. You don't say, oh, he's a communicator. But maybe we should, because actually the 3 of you, that's what you do. Different media, more the web, more the radio, and more, well, I don't know you, porque you do a lot. You do print, which is, extinct almost. Pero let's start with the first question, which is, how do you empower the Latino community through your work? And we could start with Gustavo. No, I'm kidding. Elianne.
Ladies first.
Ladies first.
With me, okay. Through my work, I think it's very important. If you look at the way that Latinos are portrayed in the media generally, in the mainstream media, first of all, we tend to be portrayed mainly in stereotypes or in assumptions that the media makes about the community. But most importantly, we tend to not be represented in the mainstream media. And so but the consequence of that is that, one, the people that need to get to learn about the community and get to know us get the wrong ideas about who we are as a community. They tend to blanket label us as being all the same when we know that's not true. And also because we are not represented necessarily in the media, that means that our voices are not being heard on issues that are critical to the community. As a matter of fact, Media Matters did a survey last year, and they found that less than 4% of the people who are invited to Sunday shows where they discuss issues important to the U.S., there were less than 4% were Latinos. And out of those, there were pretty much not a single woman. And so when that happens, that means that a lot of the things that affect us are not being talked about. And when they are talked about, they're talked about in the context of other people who have different issues than we do. So the needs of our community are not necessarily being addressed. So the way that I help change that is, one, I am very active online in terms of disseminating information and resources and writing about things that are important to our community, because I think that an informed community is an empowered community. The minute that we understand that there's an issue that affects us and how it affects us and what we can do about it, we become empowered and we are moved to action. So that's my main mission.
Adrian.
I agree with everything that Elianne just said. I think another way that, this issue of representation within the media is absolutely true, right? We don't see ourselves represented very well, and I think a big part of the reason for that is because there aren't very many Latinos in a lot of mainstream media organizations to remind people who make these decisions about who to cover that we are out there as a community and that we aren't one community, that we're a very diverse community, right? And so at NPR, which is where I work, this is true, right? There aren't very many Latinos who work there in the news division. So kind of as one of the few Latinos who works in news there, like I often find myself kind of encouraging people to think about Latinos in a more complicated way, right? A lot of times when mainstream media organizations, as Elianne was saying, think about Latinos, they think about just about immigrants, right? Which is obviously a big, huge part of the community, and very important to tell their stories. And I tell them often, and NPR tells them often. But we shouldn't only tell those stories because it kind of gives a very one-sided view of what Latinos in this country are and look like, right? And when you look at people like Donald Trump or other politicians who are trying to kind of turn their supporters against the Latino community, they think of the Latinos in this country as a very sort of specific group that they want to demonize, right? And so when you can go out there, I think one of the things that I try to do at NPR is when I go out to report, really tell like really nuanced and more complicated stories about the Latino experience. And I'm learning this myself. I mean, I'm sort of, I was born and raised in Anaheim, California. And in Southern California, the vast majority of Latinos are Mexicans, right? And as a Mexican American, it's easy for me, coming from that experience, to almost think of that being the Latino experience because that was my Latino experience, right? But one of the things that I'm trying to do here at NPR, and one of the things that the job has given me the opportunity to do, is start going to other parts of the country where the Latino community looks very different and sounds very different, has very different experiences. So I just came back from Orlando, and I'd never spent a lot of time with Puerto Ricans. Right? And I learned so many things about the way that the Puerto Rican community differs from the Mexican community. And it was kind of a learning experience for me, too, right? So a lot of times it is, you know, when you go into mainstream media organizations, it is the fact that people don't understand that Latinos are a nuanced, not monolithic community. You hear that all the time. But it's also that sometimes kind of I think we have to educate ourselves about, hey, like, let's learn more about Dominicans and Puerto Ricanos and Cubanos. And if anybody saw Orange is the New Black, I saw that. Anybody here watch that show? Did you guys see the most recent episode 2? I was watching that one last night. It's about like the feud between the Dominicans and the Puerto Ricans. Then a Mexican comes in. It's like it kind of tells a nuanced story, right? That's complicated. And when you go into a mainstream media organization, you're like, hey, like these differences exist. People's heads kind of tend to explode, you know, because they're like, what? Like you're not all just Mexican or whatever, right? But like that's really important, and that's hard to do sometimes, but it's important. And so that's what I try to do at NPR. Okay, I'm talking too much. Sorry.
Yeah, how do you empower Latinos? Both, I do it in 2 ways. I have a national platform, I have a local platform. National platform, yes, I do a column called Ask a Mexican. It's exactly what it sounds like. People send me questions about Mexicans, and I answer them. Doesn't matter what the questions may be. They could be racist, they could be sexist, they could be questions about history, about taxes, about midgets. No matter what the question is, I answer them. And the purpose of the column, I've been doing it now since 2004. The purpose of the column is to debunk and deconstruct stereotypes in a manner that's informative and profane. And so in one sense, like, I'm able to do things that a lot of people in the mainstream media can't do because I'm not part of the mainstream media. I'm what used to be called the alternative media, but that doesn't even exist anymore because alternative, basically the new mainstream, that's what I'm assuming a lot of you consume, BuzzFeed, Vice, you know, all those, a lot of web-only things. But what I learned from my experience from the Alt Weekly is this mantra that I think is very important for those of you who do want to continue your work in the Latino community. Comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. In other words, take care of the people who need to be taken care of. In this day and age, Latinos are just beyond demonized. Adrian talked about, you know, Donald Trump and other folks are trying to typecast Latinos in a very specific way. And yeah, it's as banditos, basically a stereotype that's been part of American letters and American media for over 150 years. You can't allow that to happen. You have to fight them one way or another. And so that's what on the national level, I do it with a lot of cuss words, a lot of satire, a lot of ridicule, because that's one thing I've discovered, especially on the local level. So let me just go back and into the local level. On the local level, I'm the editor of a newspaper called OC Weekly. We're a free publication. You can find us online at ocweekly.com. I've been editor there for about 4.5 years, but I've been with the paper for 13 years. If you know anything about Orange County, California, besides the Real Housewives of OC and all those stupid shows, it's that we're a notoriously conservative, nasty place. Like Adrian, I'm from Anaheim as well. What high school did you go to?
I went to Oxford.
Oh, smart guy. I went to Anaheim High, the public super Mexican school.
My brother was class of '94.
Awesome. We have to talk later. So Orange County, notoriously racist against Mexicans. So one thing I've tried to do on the local level is fight a lot of those hate groups in Orange County. And one thing I've discovered about hate, or bad people. Bad people don't mind being yelled at, don't mind being having rocks thrown at them or whatever. What they cannot stand is being ridiculed. They cannot stand exposure on a satirical level, on making films, on making, you know, funny tweets or nowadays memes or whatever. They cannot stand ridicule. And so that's what we do at the OC Weekly. We fight, you know, we afflict the comfortable in that way. But in terms of comforting the afflicted, there's many different ways to do it. As a food critic, I was able to do a book called Taco USA, How Mexican Food Conquered America. And that was really a history of Mexican food in the United States on a bigger level. But in traveling around the country, what I always tell audiences, and especially what I want to communicate to ustedes today, is tell those local stories as well, because very few people are telling the local stories of where you're coming from. I guarantee you, wherever you're from, what is the history of Latino cuisine? If you're from Miami, there's been a little documentation of the Cuban food, but what's the history of Colombian food in Miami? I know there's a lot of Colombianos there, but what's that history? I don't know what it is. So that's what I try to do on my level to empower Latinos in where we're from, is telling those stories of Latinos and trying to inspire other people to tell them as well. Here we have our own respective formats, but there's no reason why ustedes can't do that as well.
Yeah, it's so funny. You're making me think of how much one kind of like, we're talking about tweets and internet and stuff and memes, and somebody tweeted after the Orlando thing. I think it was a Muslim guy who tweeted something very deep. He said, "Wouldn't it be great to be white and represent only yourself and not your people?" And I was like, "Wow." I mean, I've been working for a long time, doing Latino media and telling Latino stories, and all of a sudden you read something on the internet and you say, "Well, I never thought about this." What a thought to kind of like describe, a dynamic in our society. Now, I would love if you guys tell me a turning point in your life. It's sort of like the day you look in the mirror and you said, I might have a nopal en la frente, that kind of thing. It's like our moment of saying, like, damn, I am not like the other kids in school. Because I think that I don't know, and maybe later you guys can tell us what's your Eureka moment. Pero empecemos con Gustavo. Why not?
Nopal en la frente, a cactus on the forehead, for those of you who don't know, especially in, watching from home. It's a saying, and especially from Mexico, saying that if you have a nopal en la frente, you obviously are trying to not be what you obviously are, which is, say, working class, Latino, Mexicano, or whatnot. It was interesting for me because, going back to Adrian, you want to talk about nuances with Latino communities and trying to teach the rest of the country that there are more Latinos than just Mexicans in the United States. But even then, when it comes to the diversity of the Mexican experience, my lord, especially in Southern California, you have Mexicanos from almost all parts of Mexico. So growing up, my family is from the state of Zacatecas, which is in central Mexico. In Anaheim, a lot of the people in Anaheim from my generation, so I'm 37 now, so from the 80s, they mostly came from four cities, two from Mexico, three cities. One from Zacatecas, Jerez is where my family's from, and then two from Jalisco, Jalostotitlan, which everyone calls Jalos, and Arandas. Those are both from Los Altos de Jalisco, where mariachi and tequila, they always remind you of these things. And also everyone's supposedly light-skinned and all that stuff. But so growing up there, you grew up in a Mexican environment in Disneyland. And I always tell people, I never was in a room that was majority white until I entered college, community college in the city of Costa Mesa, which is only like 15 minutes away from Anaheim. But when it came professionally, when did I have that nopal en la frente? I guess I was almost the opposite lesson for me. So when I started out in journalism, I sent an email to every Latino surnamed journalist in the country, all 32 of them or something. None of them responded. Only two people, actually. The author, Ruben Martinez, who's also a professor now at Loyola Marymount, and then the author, Sam Quiñones, who did this amazing book called Dreamland about America's opiate epidemic. Sam is actually his grandfather, great-grandfather was Spanish, so he doesn't claim to be Latino. He just has a last name. So I told him, hey, Sam, I want to be a Latino reporter. What should I do? He's like, well, don't be a Latino reporter. Just be a reporter. If you classify yourself as a Latino reporter, every organization you're ever going to be in is going to pigeonhole you and only allow you to say these stories. And my response to that was I want to tell those stories. And he said, you should tell those stories because no one is, but tell other stories as well. And get to yourself to a point where if you want to tell those stories, you do it on your terms. You don't join an organization that then tells you that has a vision of what Latinos are, but they won't allow you to tell the stories of how Latinos actually are. So to sum it up, it's like if you want to be a token on your own terms. And that's basically what I was able to do in my career, and that's what I've been able to dictate sort of the coverage that I think is the best way instead of allowing other people to dictate to me how I should cover.
Adrian?
Well, for my entire childhood, I was 100% sure that I was going to be a doctor. And my dad is an immigrant from Guanajuato. My mom's family has been in Anaheim since 1916. And so there's sort of two very different experiences, But on my mom's side of the family, no one had ever actually gone to college until my mom didn't, but two of my mom's siblings did. And two of them became doctors. And so that was sort of what I saw as being a cool career. One of my uncles and one of my aunts became doctors. And so I always wanted to be a doctor. And then I started school at USC in LA. and I was taking an elective class, which was Introduction to Journalism, and it was taught by the dean of the journalism school. His name was Jeff Callan. He comes from a very distinguished journalism family. His dad was the president of CBS back during the Murrow days and stuff like that. Edward Murrow was a very important journalist back in the 1950s. And anyway, so he was had a lot of friends who were in really important positions in the government and in journalism. And for this class, he would just bring people to the class every week to just talk about different aspects of the world of journalism, which was sort of telling stories, and also, as Gustavo was talking about, sort of holding people who are in power and who are powerful accountable. And I had never thought about this as something you could do. I knew what newspapers were. We watched Univision every night. I knew what news was. But I never thought about journalism as an institution that is a very important part of our society for telling people stories and shaping people's opinions about things. And so that one class sort of changed the way I thought about what I wanted to do with my life. All of a sudden, I wanted to tell people stories, right? And even after that, I wasn't necessarily focusing on Latino stories. I mean, my major became history, but I was really interested in early American colonial history, which was so strange. I'm still really, really interested in that. And right now that I'm living in D.C., I'm like, ooh, there's all this cool colonial history around here, right? It wasn't until I transferred schools and I went to school in Chicago. And the school I went to had a very good Latin American studies department and a couple of professors who did really cool work on Mexico. And so I took a couple of classes with them, and part of it was because the University of Chicago has so few Latinos there. There's so few. And you really notice it. Like Gustavo was saying, growing up in Anaheim, you're surrounded by Latinos all of the time. And then suddenly, and at USC, there were a lot of Latinos, not necessarily in the student body. There were more than at Chicago, but definitely in the neighborhood and stuff. It's a predominant Latino neighborhood where USC is. So it became so stark when I got to Chicago that I was one of the very few Latinos on campus. And so being in this department where I was learning all about sort of my family's histories, my family's heritage, where my family came from, I realized that that's kind of what I wanted to focus on. So I stayed in a history major, but I switched my focus from colonial history to history of Latin America and the United States, kind of the relationship between the two. And when I graduated from college, I was like, no, I'm going to Mexico. So I flew to Mexico, and I just got on a bus, and I was sort of traveling around Mexico for a month, and it sort of changed the way I sort of looked at everything. And then slowly, I sort of, I came back in 2009. This was 2009, and I was hanging out at my parents' house. I was looking for a job in journalism, and I went to a little place in Santana, which is, if any of you are from California, Santana is a predominantly Mexican neighborhood, city, called El Centro Cultural de Mexico. And I met amazing people there who were people like me, people who had the children of immigrants who, or immigrants themselves, who were really connecting with their Mexican culture. And I realized that I'd kind of found a community of people that were like me, and that was really important to me. And so ever since then, I've been sort of focusing on telling Latino stories. And like Gustavo, I've never tried to just tell those stories because you're very conscious when you work, especially in mainstream media organizations like mine. Mine is super mainstream. NPR is as mainstream as you can get. That people do want to kind of pigeonhole you. And I don't know that I had that experience at NPR, right? But I'm very careful not to let that happen. And so lately I have been telling stories about Latinos and stuff, but I want to tell stories about other things too. And I've only been there a year, so I'm still working on that. Part of the problem is that my beat is to cover race and identity and ethnicity in this country. And so...
so you're screwed.
so I'm kind of screwed. I mean, that's what I have to do. But you do it in sort of an interesting way, right? And I think most of you are in high school, right?
Just graduating.
Just graduated from high school. You're getting ready to go to college. You're going to find yourself in a room where you're the only Latino or Latina, And as you were saying, it's sort of this burden where you feel like if you're white in the United States, no one ever asks you to speak for white people, right? But if you're Latino in the United States, suddenly people want you to speak for every Latino in this country, right?
I love it when they say, "Tell your people," and I'm like, "Yeah, I'm gonna go home and tell."
I can hardly
my
speak for
people.
myself.
your
You know, I can hardly speak for my own family, let alone for an entire group of, an entire nationality or an entire pan-ethnic group, right? And so you always kind of, I feel like I always have to resist that, and it's not easy. At the same time, it is a privilege to be in an institution that has such a large reach. 20 million people listen to NPR every week, right? And to have the opportunity to tell nuanced stories. And so it's hard, but it's also a privilege. I'm sorry, I talked for too long.
Go ahead, Elianne.
Well, my story is not a very fun one. It's actually kind of a sad story. I come from advertising. You probably have read somewhere. But I never really considered myself a Latina, quote unquote. I think I came to this country at 16, and I consider myself a Dominican. You know, my whole life I was a Dominican. And so even though I was working in advertising, in Latino advertising, I always resisted the label because, the Latino word or Hispanic is something that is slapping your forehead when you get to this country. So I always was kind of wary of the label. And I always say that it took me, living in different countries and traveling all over the world, and then moving to a tiny little town in Massachusetts to understand what being a Latina meant. What happened is in that little town, I was a single mom back then, and my daughter and I were one of, very few families of Latino descent in the town. And so my daughter started getting discriminated at in school. And you have those are some of the darkest moments of my life, because not only am I like isolated, my family is away, and and I'm there trying to deal with being a single mom and having a full-time job and everything that entails, but I had to deal with the pain of leaving my daughter at school crying every day because she would beg me not to take her to that horrible place. So I ended up, I'm going to make the story as short as I can, but I ended up suing the school, and a big mess. But I think the story has a happy ending because, when my daughter was going to the school, they would harass her. The teachers would scream at her. They wanted to place her in special classes, like she had mental problems or something. Now, some of you have met my daughter before. I've brought her to the program before. My daughter is, I'm not going to say she's a genius, but she's pretty smart. And they wanted to put her in the classes where the kids that had like developmental, illnesses and all of that. And I knew my daughter wasn't like that, so I fought it, tooth and nail. And eventually, I ended up leaving the town and moving to Baltimore, where I live now. But that experience really made me realize, by the time I moved to Baltimore, I knew that I had to do something about that, because what I thought is, if that happens to me, somebody who's educated, somebody who understands the system here, somebody who has been around, different countries and knows how different cultures work, imagine what happens to somebody who doesn't speak the language, or somebody who doesn't have documents, or somebody who is, just trying to survive in this country. I knew I had to use my skills to do something for the community. And so as soon as I moved to Baltimore, I started, writing articles and going into the community and getting involved in causes. I started using social media to talk about all of these things and creating conversations around this, because I knew I wasn't the only person that was happening to. So the story actually has a happy ending. I found my mission in life. But most importantly, that little girl that they wanted to put in special classes is now studying in college to be a scientist. And she's actually right now, at this moment, at MIT. She's doing a research program for the summer in biochemistry. And she's one of the top students in her school. So there,
We are going to call right now that school and tell them.
Oh, and she turned down Harvard. She was accepted to Harvard, and she turned it down for MIT. So
I mean, really, Harvard is done.
So take that, Easton.
It's okay. So yeah, I carry the nopal in my mouth because every time I open my mouth, people go like, "Where are you from?" And it's very interesting that you're talking about this particular episode because this brings us to the next question, which is the obstacles that you found along the way. I got to tell you, just so you know, there's a horrible thing that is changing, by the way. I think that we've come a long way. I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, but 20 years ago, things were very different. And it's a good thing that you were not born because it wasn't pretty. But something that I can tell you for a fact, especially in media, in advertising, in television, this was the budget for the campaign for the general market, and this was the budget for the Latino campaign.
Oh, yeah.
And if you were a producer or if you're a creative and you were bilingual, you got paid less. You got paid less, and you say, "But I speak two languages." Sorry, it's your market. It's just they don't eat ice cream. You Latinos, you don't use toilet paper, so we don't invest so much in those campaigns. And this crap happens. Like yesterday, I was talking to someone about typos in Hispanic advertising. Because I don't know if you know this, but very often the billboards have gigantic. I mean, instead of Colombia, they write Colombia and crap like that. But even worse. And we were talking about that, how they make these gigantic mistakes in television and billboards. And this person was telling me, well, but with the Hispanic market, nobody cares. And I'm like, we should care. And we should complain. And I think part of the problem is that we don't complain. So let's bitch a little bit about the obstacles that we found along the way.
I'll talk about a different experience that I just had on television, actually. I worked as a consulting producer on a show for Fox called Bordertown. It was a cartoon. It was really funny. It lasted one season. It got canceled because no one saw it. And one of the big problems that we had, and myself and a good friend of mine, Lalo Alcaraz, very famous cartoonist, we were hired on specifically to make sure that the show would be, ¿cómo se dice? Que sonara bien, that it would be as authentic as possible and it would work. And, we were proud of what we did. It was really cool. But the biggest obstacle we had was trying to convince the executives that were working at Fox that Latinos would be, and specifically Mexicanos, would be okay with this show, that it would be funny. But they kept insisting, no. Mexicans are going to be offended. These were middle-aged white women who lived in the, in the west side of Los Angeles, pretending to know that they know what's going to offend Latinos. And the best example that I could give was actually an episode that I wrote. So really quick premise of Bordertown. It dealt with two families, one Mexican, one white. The white family was the Buchwalds. The head of the Buchwalds was Bud Buchwald, the world's worst border patrol agent. The Mexican family is immigrant family, Ernesto Gonzalez, and so he has a son named Ruiz. Ruiz was, your typical, basically some of my cousins, 23-year-old stoners who just want to listen to Pantera and Morrissey all the time. We all have a cousin like that, right? So I did an episode talking about how Ruiz wanted to finally become a Mexicano because for his entire life he was a pocho. And if you know what a pocho is an assimilated Mexican American. It's not a bad word. It's not a curse word, but it's an insult toward Mexican Americans. So I wrote in the episode. Everything was cool. Like, my boss liked it a lot. And then whenever you do a show in Hollywood, like you write a script and you have to turn it into what's called standards and practices. So the standards and practices are basically lawyers and executives who read to make sure that you're not offending anyone. And the tiniest thing that they think might offend people, they're going to have a problem with it. So they go back. So they read my script and they're like, what's a pocho? Like, we've never heard this word pocho before. So think about it. In Los Angeles, a city that's majority Mexican, not even Latino, majority Mexican at this point, Fox's standards and practices had not a single person who knew how to speak Mexican Spanish. So then they're like, okay, let's go talk to the executives at Fox Television. Maybe one of them knows what a pocho is. Not a single one of them knew what it was. So think about it again. Fox has not a single executive who knows how to speak Mexican Spanish, which means they have no Latinos whatsoever. So now they're thinking to themselves, where can we find a Mexican or someone in Southern California that knows what this pocho word is? So they finally get an idea. They call up Fox Deportes. And at Fox Deportes, it gets better. At Fox Deportes, they had not a single Mexican or Mexican-American there. So the guy who ends up deciding what the word pocho is an Argentino. Nothing against my Argentine brothers and sisters. Oye, che, boludo. Nothing against them. But the guy goes back, so this daisy chain or this telephone game goes all the way back to the standards and practices, and the Argentino says, oh, you can't use the word pocho. That's the F word in Spanish. You cannot use that at all. So then standards and practices goes to my boss and starts yelling at him. How dare you try to put this word in? You're going to mess up the FCC. We're going to get fined. You cannot use this word at all. And my poor boss, a nice guy from Cleveland, he's like, no, pocho's okay. Pocho's okay. Pocho's okay. And I wasn't there that day, but Lalo comes in and goes to them and says, look, this is a conference call, by the way, and says, I have a magazine called Pocho Magazine. I've been doing it for 20-some years. Some of my work is actually at the Smithsonian. Pocho is not a bad word. Now, please let us do our job. So those are, that was probably the worst fight I ever had to fight, or the most ridiculous fight. But the good thing is, we won. If you saw the episode, you could stream it live on Fox Live or Hulu. Pocho is said like 50 times or something. So, yay, Pocho.
And the saddest part is that they're like, oh, really? So pocho is a good word. Anybody out there could tell us? It's like, I would take anybody's word but yours.
Exactly. So
because then I'm in your hands, and you have control over the show that I have to have control over, even though I don't know anything.
Don't believe the Mexican that you hired. Go believe some Argentino on Fox Sports. Fox Deportes.
Adrian, what's your big obstacle so far?
Big obstacles. Oh, man, there are obstacles. Let me think.
Which ones can you talk about?
Yeah, that's the problem. That's the problem. I mean, this idea of sort of having to constantly
validate
and defend your work
is very common, right? And I had a colleague who recently had a really hard time getting. He was doing a story on something, I guess, a company in Texas called Pizza Chingona.
Yeah, now that is a little bit of a bad word.
Yeah, that would be.
Except in that context, it kind of isn't, right? Because if you know how Mexicans use that word to talk about something just being awesome, it's not. That story didn't end up airing, and she was very angry, and I think justifiably so. So that's something that's constantly an issue, right? As someone, like one of the sort of personal, I think, internal struggles that I have a lot of the times is how much to kind of project my Mexicanness or my Latinidad, because if you closed your eyes, I work in radio, if you closed your eyes and just listened to me speaking, you might not know that I'm Latino, right? Because I don't really have an accent that identifies me immediately as Latino. And I wonder sometimes how much that had to do with the fact that I've gotten to this level of the public radio world. Like how much that has to do with the fact that I've made it this far. Because if you turn it to NPR, you don't hear a lot of accents. Most of the people you hear sound the same. Sound like me.
Velvety voice.
And so it's hard, because it's like, sometimes I'm like, I wish I had an accent, But then I wonder what I've gotten this far. I don't know, I don't know. So one of the sort of struggles that I've had has been kind of like getting people to understand that I can be both fully American and fully Mexican and Mexican-American, right? And that I can inhabit both of those worlds equally well. The project that I work on is called Code Switch, which is a word that kind of describes when you switch between different situations, different ways of expressing yourself depending on the context. So when I'm on the radio, I talk like this. When I'm at home talking to my dad, I'll switch between English and Spanish. When I'm with friends, I'll get more casual and I'll use different kind of words or whatever. And that's called code switching, right? And that means that, and that's okay because we all do it, right? We sound more professional at work. We sound more casual at home. We sound more Mexican, when we're in
Spanglish,
Spanglish, whatever, all of that. And that's sort of hard for, I think, a lot of people in mainstream organizations to understand is that you can be that, right? And so one of the ways that it has come up in my work and in my professional life is kind of with the pronunciation of my name. I never had to figure out how to pronounce my name or think about it very deliberately until I got into radio, because I have to pronounce my name at the end of every story. So my name is Adrian Florido, or Adrian Florido, or Adrian Florido, or Adrian Florido, right?
Never Florido.
Florido.
And, you know, I grew up using all of those, right? I grew up using all of those. When I was in Mexico, my dad's family name was Adrian, and my dad calls me Adrian, and my mom calls me Adrian because she was born in Anaheim, her mom was born in Anaheim, her grandmother was born in Zacatecas, but lived in Anaheim from the time she was a toddler, right? They grew up Mexican-American. My grandmother calls me Adrian, right? And so I remember there was, the first radio station where I worked, there was a host. I decided once I got into radio that I was going to pronounce my name on the radio, Adrian Florido. So kind of like split the difference, right? Adrian was way too hard for people to pronounce. And Florido, people could subtypes get, but if they couldn't, they could just kind of say Florido, and I was okay with that. And I remember one time I pronounced it Adrian Florido, and the host tried to pronounce it Florido. But he's white, didn't speak Spanish. People have a really hard time, if they don't speak Spanish, doing the rolled R next to the soft D, Florido. So it would come out as things like Florido, you know. And I started noticing that friends would tell me, hey, like, we noticed that people are pronouncing your different hosts were pronouncing my last name differently. And so they're like, there's no consistency there, right? So what's your name? Mm-hmm. And so I went to the station manager and I said, hey, can you just send a note out to all the hosts asking them just to say Florido? Because I'm cool with that. I used that for a lot of my childhood at school, whatever, you know. And so she's like, okay, that's a good idea. And one of the hosts said, well, hang on a second. If you're asking us to pronounce your name as Florido, then you should pronounce it as Florido. I was like, no, because I can pronounce it correctly and you cannot, right? And I would prefer, when you say Florido or Florido or whatever, like you confuse listeners, and you're also that's just not my name, right? Florido, people understand it, they can hear it, they can imagine how it's spelled, right? And that was sort of really interesting to me, right? Because it's kind of like, it was hard for him to understand that both were okay. And also he kind of sort of wanted to make it about sort of himself, right? He wanted to feel comfortable doing what he was doing because he didn't want it to seem like he couldn't pronounce my name. Because he would introduce my pieces, here's Adrian Florido, and I would come out saying, I'm Adrian Florido. And it was like, oh, wait, Adrian's pronouncing his name correctly. Clearly this host can't do it. And he didn't want to make himself look bad, right? Since then, he and I are actually excellent good friends, you know? But that's sort of a constant thing. When I got to NPR, something different happened, which was my current editor, who I love, is an amazing editor, and she might be watching right now. Hi, Alicia.
Hello.
Alicia Montgomery?
Yeah.
Yeah, she used to be my editor.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I used to do commentary for her.
Oh,
yeah.
Tell her what's up.
She's the best. Tell her right herself.
She's awesome.
Watching right now.
You're awesome, Alicia.
Shout out
Everybody.
to Alicia.
Hey, Alicia.
So she told me, hey, like, you should pronounce your name Adrian Florido. Just don't, because for her the thing is like, we as people of color at an NPR mainstream organization should not apologize for who we are. Like, we should pronounce our names the way that we feel like they should be pronounced. And I said, okay, that's cool, but like, yes, I'm Adrian with my family at home, and blah, blah, but I'm also Adrian. I grew up as Adrian, you know, in school with my grandmother. And but I feel like, Alicia, I feel like you really wanted me to pronounce it as Adrian, because it was like making a little bit more of a statement, and that was, I wish I could, but because people were, because I knew that it was also going to pose a challenge to people, and I didn't want people to constantly be butchering my name, I was like, Adrian is totally cool, you know, like Adrian is cool because that is also who I am. If you listen to my grandmother's voice messages to me, she'll say, hey, Adrian. Actually, she'll say, hey, Adrian, right? And it's like, she's sort of omits the I in there. And my brother does the same thing. And it's like, and that's all part of like the beauty of the Latino experience is that all of these things can fit. All of these things can fit. And speaking, I'm sorry, can I say one more little quick thing?
Of course.
If you listen,
The floor is yours.
Speaking of marketing, right? If I was talking to some folks, because the Smithsonian Museum of American History recently started acquiring materials from the most prominent Latino marketing firms in the country, because they wanted to include more of that in their collections. And I was speaking to some of the people. Los Orsi from Santa Monica,
Yes.
Lopez Negrete from San Antonio. And they've all pointed me to this commercial that McDonald's recently did, right? Where it was kind of like, back in the day, there was no marketing budget for Latinos in marketing, right? And they imagined that to reach the Latinos, all they had to do was take a commercial that they did in English for white Americans and translate it into Spanish. And that was the way that people who did marketing in this country were employed for many, many years.
Oh, yeah.
And then more recently, right? More recently, they've started to do commercials for Latinos because they realize how important we are as a market, right? And they all said, look at this commercial that McDonald's aired during the Oscars last year. It's about a boy, a teenager, who has his first day on the job at McDonald's. And he goes in and he rides his bike there and he is working the drive-thru. And his first customers, he's like, hi, welcome to McDonald's, can I take your order? Hi, hi, is Gabriel there? And it was his parents, and they were his first customers. And he pronounced, one of the things, I knew that this commercial had been written by a Latino, a Mexican-American or something, because he said, hi, this is Gabriel, can I take your order? And his parents say, hi, is Gabriel there? Right? He pronounced his name differently from his parents, and you could tell that he was a Mexican-American who had grown up here, but who was a Latino, and his parents pronounced it differently, right? And that, these little subtle nuances that sort of you start to realize that there are more and more Latinos who are kind of coming onto the scene and sort of putting their imprint on things, and that's the stuff that really resonates with people, right? And it's like, I'm sorry, no, that's enough.
But listen, connecting that with your story, I think the first day of kindergarten is the day that you have your first identity crisis. And that's the day that you are like, okay, home is one thing and the real ugly world is here. And everybody's like 4 years old, but they will make your life miserable and they will make you question even how you say your name. You see, my response always is, my name is Alberto, but you can call me Alberto. It works like a charm. Nobody has tried to call me Al in 25 years, and I'm proud of that. Elianne,
Well, before I tell my story, I just want to say this panel is brought to you by McDonald's. I'm joking. Anyway, it's funny that Adrian is saying this about the name because it happens to me all the time. My name is Elianne, right? And that's how you pronounce it in Spanish. But I'm called Elaine, Lilian, anything that sounds like. And my response is usually, don't worry, I've been called worse things. But it's those little microaggressions that happen. I go through those things all the time. And until recently, after I started working in this is when I have started noticing that these kind of things happen all the time. I'll tell you a short story. I just did jury duty a couple of weeks ago, and I showed the ID to the woman at the counter. This is an American lady, obviously. She was white. And I showed my passport, my U.S. passport, to the lady. And she goes through the whole thing. She looks at it. She writes down my name. And then she asks me, are you a U.S. citizen? And I was taken aback. I mean, not only because of the dull nature of the moment, because you just saw my U.S. passport, and it's blue.
And you're in jury duty, which only American citizens can do.
And I'm doing jury duty. But it's those kind of things that happen constantly as you go around. If you go to a restaurant and the Anglo waiter doesn't want to take your order and they send like the Latino to take care of you because they assume that you don't speak the language. Or, when you call into a customer service thing and they switch you automatically to Spanish the minute that they listen to your voice. Those kind of microaggressions happen all the time. And I've become a lot more outspoken whenever those things happen. I think it's very important that we call them out. when they happen, because that is not only standing up for yourself, which is very important, and we should all do it, but it's a teachable moment for the other person. It's the opportunity to change a mind, and maybe the person stops doing it, or at least becomes more conscious whenever they do it automatically. So that's one of the main obstacles, and it irks me to no end.
But I got to tell you, there's no time better invested than the one I spent complaining. I think we should all complain constantly.
Oh, yeah.
Actually, here's a tip. If you want to pay less on your cable bill, just call them and complain. And say that you're going to disconnect, and they'll put you through the retention department, and they will cut off maybe $50.
Yeah.
So do it. Do it today.
Yes.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about, there's two questions here. So maybe we can, kind of like connect them somehow, or you can pick and choose. Okay, so I do this show once a year called Habla, which is, thank God, keeps going and going. Put the show out there, never hear anything. Then one day I get on Facebook and somebody shared a segment. I'm like, wee, they love me. Or somebody tweets something and, I had a bad day and now I have a good day because somebody got it, How do you guys engage with your audience? How do you know that you're reaching, and it doesn't have to be Latinos. It could be people who say, wow, you kind of like opened my eyes. Then, thank you for talking to my manager and complaining about the way I treated you.
Yeah.
But tell me a little bit about that. And memorable moments, maybe, when you connected with your audience.
Well, I'm just going to say I connect with my audience all the time just because of the nature of what I do. And on social media, it's so easy to connect with everyone. My main problem now is trying to connect with the other side of social media, which is the trolls. And I get those all the time. And I usually try to be reasonable. So if a person says something that I'm not agreeing with, or throws in a wrench on whatever conversation is going, again, it's an opportunity to maybe, change their mind. So I always try that first, but lately, if you follow me online, I'm not afraid to get political. So lately I've just been blocking people left and right because it's become so polarized. That is crazy. But for the most part, my job, I think, is kind of creating these conversations and also opening the conversations to beyond just our community. I'm always curious to know what I'm married to a white dude, but so I always want to know what other people think because that teaches me how to approach those kind of questions that come up or those kind of discrepancies in the way that we are perceived and the way that we really are.
Adrian, short, please.
Yes,
No, I'm
short,
kidding.
Short. No, really, because I'm still working on this part. I'm still working on connecting more with the audience. Twitter and sort of Twitter, I tweet things out. The way I know that things are connecting is because we get a lot of emails from listeners. Because there are so many people listening, you just get emails who say either they liked a story or they didn't or whatever, right? And sometimes when you get something from an email from, let's say, someone who is how do I say this?
Displeased?
Well, yeah, no, I was actually saying someone who's pleased.
Oh.
Yeah, I was actually thinking sometimes you get emails from people who are very happy with the story, but not for the reasons you wanted them to be, And it's like, like maybe I didn't quite get that one right, Or the, NPR's audience, and NPR knows this very well, is the vast majority of listeners are white, sort of middle-aged, like we're working on changing that. But still, like, the people I'm trying to engage with are people of color, people who are younger, people who are Latinos. And I really feel like I want to get more of those people engaged in addition to all the people who are already engaged. And so how do you do that? I'm still figuring that out. I don't know. I feel like Gustavo is probably the best person to speak to to this because he has such a huge following on Twitter and is constantly active on there.
Yeah, I respond to everything and anything on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, mostly because the way I see it, and it doesn't matter if they're happy or they're not happy. For me, the very fact that someone had a reaction to something that you did, that's reason enough to respond back to them, because you're not, no matter what you do in life, you're not guaranteed that people are going to care. Like, you cannot even, like, you know, especially, you know, if, Adrian cannot make people listen to NPR. I cannot make people read my stuff. You cannot make people respond to your tweets or any of your activism. You can't. So what you have to do is just, this is what I was telling my young writers, is do whatever you do, be able to stand by it. Like, if you cannot stand by it, then don't do it. And then at that point, come hell or high water, people are going to respond one way or another. And the worst, like for me, the worst thing that can happen is when people don't respond to something that I write. Nothing, like all the haters and, oh boy, you want to see into the dark depths of humanity, follow me on Twitter. And you'll see the people, follow the people that things will swing back. And me, the Wall Street Journal actually complimented our newspaper. They said we had the most, an editor of Wall Street Journal, he said, you guys have one of the most lively social media accounts of all mainstream America, of American news organizations, because we're ruthless. And someone put it better, we troll the trolls. People end up blocking us because we're so incessant in that. So that's sort of on the troll side. And my response to that, though, only do it if you're getting paid. Only respond to trolls if you're getting paid to do that.
Nobody got time for that.
Exactly. Other than that, don't that. But on the other hand, if you do things, all you can do in terms of, like, you never know when stories are going to resonate. So, for instance, if we're in 2016 now, 12 years ago, I did almost, it wasn't even a series. It was just back in that time, there was a huge, the huge Catholic Church sex abuse scandal was going on in Orange County. It, of course, started in Boston with a recent film Spotlight. That was like 2000, 2001. In Orange County, that hit in 2004. So I did a lot of stories. So I think it was earlier this year, but a guy came up to me and told me that a story that I did about his former priest, who was like the worst pedophile priest in Orange County history. The guy admitted to he admitted to molesting at least 31 boys, because that's all he could remember, 31. Okay. And the guy who read it wasn't a victim, but knew people were victims, and he thanked me for that story. And to me, like, I did that story 12 years ago, and it resonated with this person so much that he was waiting for all this time to meet me in person and talk to me about it. And stuff like that's really powerful and moving. And that, to me, it shows me, like, this is why you do stories. This is why you do whatever you do. Whether you're into music, whether you're into arts or whatever, you do things because you know they're worthwhile, and then after that, hopefully they resonate and mean something to someone, but you can never guarantee that. So those moments are the ones like, okay, this is why I do it. Why I do this is not to fight haters and losers and like whack jobs, but to resonate with people that matter ultimately.
Okay, so the next question is kind of deep, so get ready. And it's about the most important lesson that you've learned about the community. And I do want to share at least the one that comes to mind to me, and it's thanks to Habla, because everything I know about Latinos in the U.S. Habla has been such a gift in my life, because I really had to talk to everybody and anybody. And we had this lady, she was incredible, in Chicago. She was Puerto Rican from Chicago, from Division, the neighborhood, right? And she, her name was Navarro. That was it. She had no first name. She only had a last name because she was born in a hospital where nobody spoke Spanish. So when she was born, her parents couldn't communicate with the nurse, and they issued her birth certificate only with a last name. So legally, she was Navarro. But she assumed that as like Madonna, Cher, like that was her, like Navarro, yeah. So she came, and I've never met anyone so passionate about her culture. Even though she was born in Chicago, she was super Puerto Rican. Actually, we call the piece Chica Rican because she was like Puerto Riqueña from Chicago, right? And she told me something. First of all, she wanted to do it in Spanish, and her Spanish, gotta tell you, sucked. Pero, she was so adamant about it. I'm like, we gotta do it in Spanish. Don't worry, Navarro, whatever you want. And she started talking about. She explained to me. I was life is a little bit complicated, but I came from Venezuela when I was 24, and I came to the country that I wanted to live in. So, I didn't feel that I had to prove myself to anybody. I'm like Venezuelan because you can hear it in my voice, and because that's who I am, but I didn't have that identity issue. But she explained to me that when you are in that position, where you were born in the U.S., but you belong in a different culture, you are more, in her case, she was more Puerto Rican than the Puerto Ricans in the island. And she explained that to me. She said, like, people in Puerto Rico, they don't care about salsa, they don't care about the food the same way I care. Because in her case, it defined her identity in the U.S. I mean, she had two choices. She could just assimilate and become just anybody else, or just, kind of like embrace those roots. That's what she did, and I was like, wow. Because it was so far from my experience. So what has been that big lesson that you guys have learned with your audience and doing your stories, doing your work? Or one of them?
I mean, the easy one is that there's so many varied responses. Like, again, we are not monolithic, not even close. Like, especially, I'll talk about this with my Ask a Mexican column. Some of the biggest haters of Ask a Mexican, immediately saying it's stereotypical, it's this, and that, are Latinos, are Mexicanos. But at the same time, are Mexicanos who don't speak any Spanish, they're Chicanos, and, going back, I think it's very true. Some of the most Chicanos on earth don't speak Spanish at all because they're third, fourth generation, but they find it as a way to connect with their identity. On the other hand, some of my biggest fans of Ask a Mexican are Mexicanos themselves, de Mexico, whether, DF or Guadalajara or whatever, who read my column. They know how to speak English, but they love the fact that, that I'm, as they say, you're going against the pinche gringos this way. Like the very famous chef Javier Plasencia from Tijuana, I met him and he's like, oh yeah, I know exactly who you are. You write that awesome column, like, échale ganas, or like more profane ways, let's put it that way. So I would never expect that to happen. But in that sense, like it is a very profound question. There's so many things. Another thing I'll say, this one's not as nice. This is what I've been saying, especially this season. Who hates Mexicans more than Donald Trump? Mexicans. Some of the people who will bash each other worse than anyone are Mexicanos. Artists find this all the time. And on the local level, when I do stories about Latino politicians, I get trashed by other Latinos saying you should be in line. You should always be covering your community positively. And my response to that is no. If you're going to cover your community, you have to do it with the truth. And sometimes we all know there are people in our comunidad who are not the best citizens, who are not doing the best for the good of our community, and you have to call those people out as well. So, yeah, those are my insights.
Take your time. Take your time.
Okay. I think and I already sort of referenced this a little bit, but I think one of the most important lessons I've learned, and actually a lesson I'm learning, is like Gustavo was saying, that Latinos are such an incredibly diverse community in this country, and that it's important to let that sort of shine through in the reporting. So I was in Orlando this last weekend. When the shooting happened, they put me on a plane the next day. And I was there for a few days reporting. And, like I said, I'd never spent a lot of time with Puerto Ricans. I have a couple of Puerto Rican friends, but that's it. And just to see what a different experience it is was like really interesting to me. I was kind of speaking a little bit about the story that you were talking about. Like, I interviewed this woman who I was kind of asking, the reason I went to Puerto Rico was because, to Orlando, was because when I saw that the shooting had happened on Latin night at this gay club, I knew that the majority of the victims were going to be Latinos. And I knew that NPR probably wasn't going to send any Spanish speakers. And so I kind of sent off an email and I said, I think I should go. So I went. And I wanted to get at this sort of Latino stories out of this tragedy, and I spoke to a woman on the street near where the shooting happened, and I asked her, is it more difficult for you to see this happening because so many of the victims are Latinos? And she said that it was more difficult, but not kind of for the reason that I thought she was going to say, which was because they're Latinos and we're Latinos, right? For her, it was like, she was Puerto Rican, born in Puerto Rico, and as you may know, if you're born in Puerto Rico, you're a U.S. citizen because it's an American territory. And so for many, many years, she's lived in the States, in Florida, and says she's always trying to feel like she's an American, which she is by birth. But because she's a Latina, people don't let her be American, right? People say like, oh, you're a Latina, and she feels the same kind of discrimination that every other Latino in this country faces. I talked about this on our podcast a little bit this week. And she said, this shooting feels like I'm even less able to be American because it feels like Latinos were targeted, right? Puerto Ricans were targeted. And so not only do people not let me be American because I'm Puerto Rican, even though I'm American, also now they're targeting us and saying, you don't belong here, right? So I feel even less American. And that was like so kind of complicated for me to like understand, right? I mean, it was so interesting for me to understand that dynamic, you know? And it's so nuanced. It speaks to how nuanced the Latino community is in this country and how different their experiences are. That you can have a Puerto Rican who's really trying to be American because she is, and a Puerto Rican who's really trying to be Puerto Rican because she is. You know, and that those things you can hold both of those ideas in your brain at the same time, or you can try to. Most people can't, or don't want to. And so the lesson that I'm learning and that I'm trying to learn is to really like be as open as possible to all of the Latino experiences and then sort of put those out there again so that people can understand how diverse our community is. And that's one of the challenges that you all are going to face no matter what field you get into, right? And I think it's really important that we do that.
Yeah, listen.
Yeah.
Elianne, go for it.
Well, I think, and this is very personal, obviously, because it works differently for everyone. But I think in doing the work that I do, the biggest lesson that I have learned is that you have to walk your walk. You know, I started out just talking online and you know, doing chats and doing those kind of things, and kind of creating those conversations online about issues. And it wasn't until I started getting involved in the same issues, but in, you know, on the ground with like the organizations or the individuals that are actually doing the work, that I learned the power of fighting for our community. And it's, you know, it's not just about, not that there's anything wrong with, you know, tweeting and putting things out there on Facebook, but the minute that you marry the two is such a powerful way to defend our community. And I think all of us, you know, no matter what it is that we're doing, we're writing, we're talking on the radio or whatever it is, we all want to stand up for our communities, because the word community is like an abstract, right? But the word community is your mom, your dad, your sisters and brothers. And so it's something that touches us so deeply. And knowing that you're doing even a tiny little bit to stand up for your own people, for your family, for your sangre, that makes all the difference in the world.
One more? Oh, we're opening for questions?
Oh, I can talk some. No, I'm just.
We are opening the floor for questions. Yes, we are. So I hope you guys have questions. Bring it. Yes.
What's your favorite part of being Hispanic?
The food. I'm going to say. I'm kidding. There's so many things. Guys,
The question was, what's our favorite part of being Latino or Hispanic? For me, it's being a monkey wrench into the United States, because we have the United States, if you want to, again, we're talking about monoliths and stereotypes, but if you think about it, we have been confounding the United States almost since the beginning, because they cannot figure out what the hell are we. Are you Mexican? Are you Puerto Rican? Are you white? Are you black? Are you Chinese? Are you this? Are you that? The great thing is we're all of it, and then including ourselves. And at least, you know, what we're seeing right now with the current political climate nationally, it's the same thing that happened in California 20 years ago. I mean, it's been going on forever. And for me, I see it from afar, and I know it's tough times right now, but you also know that this is the last gasp, I really think, of a dying race. And I'm not saying the white race. I'm saying the dumb race, the idiots.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
these are people who come from this idea that America was supposed to be this, and that, and what you see in this room wasn't part of the United States. You're growing up in a generation who sees those stereotypes of the past. You're like, wait, what? Like, really? Like, you really think that me being in this country and growing up here, that I'm somehow not part of this country? It's ridiculous. Like, really quickly, and then, I'll pass it along. For me, I always love to tell the story every Memorial Day. The first casualty of the Iraq War in Orange County was a guy by the name of Jose Angel Garibay. And he came to this country as a baby. He was undocumented. And he was undocumented for years and years and years. When he was in the Army, he was no longer, no, I think he was Marines. He had gotten his, not citizenship, but he was a legal resident to be able to fight in the United States, or for the United States. And he received his citizenship only when he got killed in Iraq. They gave his family his citizenship papers on the day of his funeral. And I love telling that story, though, to Orange County, and especially on the wider scale, because for all these people who say, oh, illegals are ruining this country, this and that, I'm like, no, they're just human beings. Like, they're like anyone else. My dad was undocumented. They're fighting on our battlefields. And in fact, one of the first casualties, period, and maybe Adrian knows more about this, of the Iraq War was a Guatemalan immigrant whose name escapes me right now, but he was also undocumented. So I just love that we're a monkey wrench. And the good thing is that this monkey wrench is gonna, it's the future. It's the current.
Yeah, I don't think I have much more to say other than that. I mean, I think this idea that we're so much more complicated, and it is as frustrating as it can be, it can also be a little bit fun to see people
freak out
about the complexities, and just in general. I mean, about being Latino in the U.S. I mean, it's our people, right? I mean, it's just like, it's sort of the warmth, it's the food, it's the way we get together, the way we have parties, the way that our parents discipline us. It's all like, it's all much more chancla. There was an episode.
There was a chancla episode in Border Town. Yep.
It was. It's all. I mean, I'm sure you all know what it is to be. I mean, it's like we're amazing, right? I mean, we're amazing. So.
Well, it's not to love, right? But I think for me, it's more like being able, having prior rejected the label and now kind of like owning it back. It's almost like finally embracing every side of me without shame and without apology. And so, so that is so liberating once you are able to say, yeah, so I'm Latina, so what? Sue me, and just enjoying every part of your culture. And nobody has to apologize for it. That's it.
Yeah, you're making me think that maybe my favorite part of being Latino is being gay. Because it's the same. It's like, if you don't like gays, you're not going to like me.
Tough.
If you don't like Latinos, you're not going to like me. But it's an amazing lesson. I think what's great about Latinos in the U.S., Latinos and, of course, every other ethnicity that is not, the I guess the white ethnicity, which is not an ethnicity, is a group. I don't even know how to describe it. Not in a derogative sense. I'm simply saying that, at least you can say, there's nothing better, I think, for you as a person than to be the other. Because as the other, first, it's not fun, right? Because you're kind of like not invited. But then you can see the party from afar and you can learn from it and criticize. And then your criticisms become very valuable to that party. And I think that is our duty. We must criticize.
I mean, here's kind of one of the things, I mean, to kind of get at what you're saying, I mean, it really is an incredible time to be a Latino if you're trying to get into just about any, I think, any sort of field that has been dominated by whites, right? Because I think at least in the news media, okay, I'll speak only for the news media then, most organizations know that they've really dropped the ball and that they need to diversify, They know it, they sense it, they talk about it, but they just don't know how to do it, right? So they know that they need us. And so it's cool, to sort of be needed, right? Like, I feel like NPR needs, maybe not me, but people like me.
NPR needs you more than you need them.
That's right.
That's what it boils down to.
No, that is
true.
But
they also, they're going to be calling the Argentinian.
Getting fired.
If I want to leave NPR, I can leave NPR and I can find a job in a lot of different places, right? And that's going to be true for all of you, right? It gives you a lot of power in terms of being able to determine where you go and it's like sort of what your career looks like. Because because people need our voices, right? So that's all I'll say.
This is one of those moments when you wish you had sunglasses to go deal with it.
But in a more positive way, I think that this is your very valuable lesson. No, you will be bridging cultures wherever you go, and that is for any organization, for any institution, whoever hires you, or whatever business you start, you will have that capacity that some people don't have. So that's enough to pat yourself on the back. More questions, and there's a microphone over there. Yeah, I know. And make sure that you walk pretty when you get there.
Don't be shy.
Exactly. There you go. Let's sing a little something while you get to the microphone.
No bad question.
Hi, hello.
Is that on?
Oh. Hi, my name is Julia, and I have a question. So a lot of people these past couple of days have been bringing up Trump because he's very outspoken and opinionated about the Latinos. And I'm asking this because I personally met a couple of people, but how do you feel about the Latinos who have and are going to vote for Trump?
It's inevitable. Again, we're not a monolith. I personally find Donald Trump to be the most Mexican candidate out there. He reminds me of a priista, autocratic, corrupt AF, as you could say it. Just a complete whack job. Why wouldn't Mexicans want to vote for him? Oh, yeah, it's because he wants to deport us all and all that stuff. But look, intelligent minds can disagree. On my end, of course, our coverage of Trump has been just nonstop criticizing. But then just Google Donald Trump OC Weekly, and you'll find an image that I can't describe to you guys right now. So.
Well, and on the plus side, you'll have a lot of work when if he becomes president.
I'll be thrown in jail at that point. He's already said he wants to sue reporters that he doesn't like for libel, and he's done that in the past. So,
oh my Lord!
Yeah, but but all that said, it's especially as reporters, if you do find those people, you should cover them. You should not let your biases. I personally do not like Trump at all, and I think people who support him have a screw loose in their head. But that said, I'll still talk to them. Right now, in fact, I'm trying to do a big story about here's a child of former illegal immigrants who's going to vote for Donald Trump. Now, go try to figure that one out in your mind.
Yeah. But, every time you have a group that has been, again, excluded, it's what they call the ghetto mentality. You're going to have self-hatred. You're going to have a lot of conflictive feelings, and they might turn into another vote for Mr. Trump.
I mean, I think when you encounter people who are Trump supporters who are Latino, it also is an opportunity to use it as a jumping-off point to explore again the complexities of Latino communities, right? I think that a lot of the Latinos who support him, let's say you're talking about someone who has Mexican heritage, right? Maybe their family has been here 3 or 4 generations, right? They're not connected to that sort of, they're Latino in name and in appearance maybe, but maybe not culturally, right? And so much of who you are and what your politics are depends on kind of your culture and how you see yourself as a member of this society, right? So if your family is Mexican but has been in the United States for 4 or 5 generations, you don't really think of yourself as a Mexican anymore. You think of yourself more as an American, and maybe that gives you sort of that makes it easier for you to support someone like Trump, right? That's a valid experience, right? It doesn't mean you don't have to agree with it, but it's a valid experience. You might have Cubans who support Trump because maybe they never had to go through the experience of coming to the country undocumented, right? Because they have a sort of they're privileged in terms of being able to come to this country, unlike most Latin Americans, right? They don't have to worry about being undocumented or deported, right? So I mean, it's just again, you look at I think you have to sort of look at who are these people who are supporting Trump, who are also Latino, and what does it say about their family's experiences or whatever.
But also remember that Trump has been on television for a good decade, selling this. The millionaires are for you. We're here to help you. And people watch television, and I think a lot of people have bought into that character that he's been selling. And I have met actually Latinos who moved to the U.S. not that long ago, who are like, they like that. There's this, in Latin America, there's a lot of like, mano dura. Yeah,
caudillo. The
It's called
caudillo mentality.
caudillismo, yeah.
Exactly. And some
Strong
people
man.
really like that. They think that that's the only way to create political change with one person instead of like organizing people and
Instead of democracy.
exactly.
What I try to do when I find people like that, and trust me, I'm married to somebody who is a Republican, so I experienced it firsthand. But I think you cannot change everybody's minds, obviously, and forget about trying to argue a person out of their deep-seated beliefs. So what I'm more excited about is the movement that Trump has caused in our community to become citizens and to register to vote. And that energy is something that I hope continues until November so that we all get out there and vote, and those of us who can. And the ones who cannot vote, go and help register people who could. I'm really more excited about that. I'm trying to focus on that and get more people into that frame of mind than worrying about the people who are pro him.
And we have time for one last question. Bachelor number one. I'm kidding.
Okay, English is also not my first language, so bear with me. There's like small questions in a big topic I want to bring.
Say it in Spanish if you want. It's fine.
Okay. Pues,
Sinvergüenza.
No, don't call her sinvergüenza.
Okay, Adrian, like,
Sí.
no, habías dicho que a lot of in the workplace you work, there's no opportunity, like.
Español está bien, habla
Está bien,
español.
voy a hablar español. No hay mucho latino trabajando en el trabajo que tú estás, por ejemplo.
Sí.
Pero yo pensé que tal vez no es tanto porque la gente no esté interesada, tal vez porque no hay oportunidad, como que para que nos dejen. Ahora mismo tú acabas de decir el ejemplo tuyo de about your accent y que tal vez tú no sabes si por eso es que has tenido todas las oportunidades. Y cuando dijiste el ejemplo del Orlando shooting, la persona que hablaste, de hecho de las 50 víctimas que pasó ahí, solamente 23 de ellas eran puertorriqueñas, ¿verdad? Soy de Puerto Rico. Y pues allá como que sí sufrimos bastante por eso. Y entonces, claro, me simpatizo con la señora y entiendo que por qué ella dice eso, porque es la verdad, como que no nos dejan sentirnos americanos, no nos dejan sentirnos parte de ustedes. Incluso a veces las poquitas oportunidades que he tenido de estar aquí en Estados Unidos, como que se siente cuando te miran o cuando hablan. De hecho, con toda la crisis que ha estado pasando en Puerto Rico y cuando venimos para acá, pues hablan de eso y hablan de una manera negativa que afecta a uno y que claro, pero uno quiere echar para adelante y pues es más bien como que un comentario que, ¿verdad? Quiero ver sus reacciones sobre el respecto, pero sí como que yo no creo que es que la gente no esté interesada, sino es que la gente no nos dejan, la sociedad no nos dejan poder expandirnos o expresarnos o poder ser quienes queremos ser.
Your question
entonces,
is...
pero había pregunta también de, o sea, ¿por qué? Más que nada un comentario.
Yeah, like I wanted
Sí.
to comment on that because like you said all those examples and first you said that people like weren't interested, and I just think that maybe it's not the interest, it's more like there's no opportunity for us. Maybe like it's not a question per se, más bien como quiero ver sus reacciones o qué piensan al respecto, ya que pues cambié un poquito ese tema.
Sí. Right. I mean, I think that there's not. I think when I was talking about. Did I say that people weren't interested, or what? I'm trying to remember like what I was saying.
No, I'm paying attention to you.
You're on video, Adrian.
Not a lot of people, Latin people were involved in your workplace, and that you said about the interest, like a lot of people are not interested in like.
A lot of your bosses aren't interested
in
in
that
your
angle of the
particular
story.
stories and in the angles that you bring.
Right. No, I mean, I think people are interested. I mean, I think, when I was talking about there not being a lot of Latinos in the workplace, say NPR, for example, I wasn't saying that it was because Latinos are not interested in working there. I was just sort of stating that as a fact, that there aren't enough, and that's something that's really important, because there are many Latinos who would like to, right? But for example, when you think about like mainstream organizations, or a place like NPR maybe, places tend to look for candidates for positions in sort of in the same places, or they rely on sort of references from people that they know. And so if the majority of an organization is white, and most of the people's friends who work there are white, and they reach out to their networks and say, well, their networks look a lot like them, right? And so, like, the really important thing that I think a lot of Latinos within the building are trying to do right now, I'm speaking specifically about NPR here, is really push management to hire more Latinos into places where they're going to be editors and managers, because you see that when you hire people like that, people bring more people like themselves, right? People get mad a lot of the times when they say, why are you going to hire Latinos or black people or Asian people, and like, why does it have to be about race? Why do you say, what? They think of the word like quota as sort of being an ugly word and stuff like that, and this idea that you hire Latinos so they can bring in more Latinos. But it's like, if you look at who a lot of white managers hire, they hire white people, right? Like, that's just true. That's just a fact. And that's why a place like NPR has stayed so white for so long, right? And I think it's why so many mainstream organizations have. It's because they haven't given Latinos the opportunity that we do want, right? And I think, I'm sorry if I was confusing when I was talking about that, but that's kind of what I was getting at. It's like there aren't a lot of Latinos in these organizations, and that's a problem, because we do need more opportunities to get into those positions so that we can start to change them. Because it's not just a moral sort of thing. It's not just like a moral imperative, right? It's just smart journalism, and it's smart business if we're talking about kind of keeping places like NPR, like any other organization, alive, right? The country is changing, right? The country is changing. If you saw that episode of Orange is the New Black, there's that scene where they're standing on the stairs and the woman is like, deal with it. Like, the country's changing, you've got to deal with it, right? Like, it's getting browner. And people have to deal with it, and they have to realize that if they want to stay alive, they need to look more like America. And if they don't, then they're not going to survive, and then they're screwed.
But the interesting thing is that I don't think that the country is changing. I think that the media is changing. And in that sense, in defense of, white Americans, they've been looking at a mirror that is distorted, because that mirror never reflected everybody else around them. And I know, see, this is my Gandhi moment. No, pero seriously, I think that we've been duped, and they have been duped as well. And I think that what's happening now is that the media is finally recognizing the diversity. I talk to people who say, well, Latinos up and coming. I'm like, Latinos have been up and coming for like 100 years. I mean, don't tell me now. Native 80s. Americans are like, Mexicans, essentially. What are we talking about? Like, it didn't happen yesterday. What's happening now is that, there's a representation in the media, and there's a political representation, and that's what is going to make a big difference. And with those words...
Unfortunately, our time is up. Please give our panelists a round of applause. Our moderator did a wonderful job in moderating the conversation. For our Facebook viewers, please continue posting, sharing the link. The video will be archived on the Smithsonian Latino Center Facebook page. Please view the video, share it with your family and friends, and continue the conversation in your communities. Thank you very much for coming and attending today's live conversation, and we hope to see you again in future programs at the Smithsonian Latino Center.